the double doors. The Kender twisted his head. Behind him loomed the dragon, more horrible than anything he had imagined, more terrifying than the black dragon in Zatsaroth. The dragon breathed on them again, and once more Tas was enveloped by flame. The paintings on the walls blazed, furniture burned, curtains flared like torches, smoke filled the room. But none of it touched him and Seston and Fizban. Tasselhoff looked at the mage in admiration, truly impressed. "How long can you keep this up?" he shouted to Fizban as they wheeled around a corner, the double bronze doors in sight. The old man's eyes were wide and staring. "I have no idea," he gasped. "I didn't know I could do it at all." Another blast of flame exploded around them. This time, Tasselhoff felt the heat and glanced at Fizban in alarm. The mage nodded. "I'm losing it," he cried. "Hang on," Tasselhoff panted. "We're almost to the door. He can't get through it." The three pushed through the bronze double doors that led from the gallery back into the hallway, just as Fizban's magic spell wore off. Before them was the secret door, still open, that led to the mechanism room. Tasselhoff flung the bronze doors shut and stopped a moment to catch his breath. But just as he was about to say, "We made it," one of the dragon's huge clawed feet broke through the stone wall right above the Kender's head. Seston, giving a shriek, headed for the stairs. "No!" Tasselhoff grabbed him. "That leads to Verminard's quarters." "Back to the mechanism room!" Fizban cried. They dashed through the secret door just as the stone wall gave way with a tremendous crash. But they could not shut the door. "I have a lot to learn about dragons, apparently," Tas muttered. "I wonder if there are any good books on the subject." "So I have run you rats into your hole, and now you are trapped," boomed Pyros's voice from outside. "You have nowhere to go, and stone walls do not stop me." There was a terrible grinding and grating sound. The walls of the mechanism room trembled, then began to crack. "It was a nice try," Tas said ruefully. "That last spell was a doozy. Almost worth getting killed by a dragon to see." "Killed?" Fizban seemed to wake up. "By a dragon? I should say not. I've never been so insulted. There must be a way out." His eyes began to gleam. "Down the chain." "The chain?" repeated Tas, thinking he must have misunderstood, what with the walls cracking around him and the dragon roaring and all. "We'll crawl down the chain. Come on." Cackling with delight, the old mage turned and ran down the tunnel. Seston looked dubiously at Tasselhoff, but just then the dragon's huge claw appeared through the wall. The Kender and the gully dwarf turned and ran after the old magician. By the time they reached the great wheel, Fizban had already crawled along the chain leading from the tunnel and reached the first tree trunk tooth of the wheel itself. Tucking his robes up around his thighs, he dropped down from the tooth onto the first rung of the huge chain. The Kender and gully dwarf swung onto the chain after him. Tas was just beginning to think they might get out of this alive after all, especially if the dark elf at the bottom of the chain had taken the day off, when Pyros burst suddenly into the shaft where the great chain hung. Sections of the stone tunnel caved in around them, falling to the ground with a hollow, booming thud. The walls shuddered, and the chain started to tremble. Above them hovered the dragon. He did not speak, but simply stared at them with his red eyes. Then he drew in a huge breath that seemed to suck in the air of the whole valley. Tas started instinctively to close his eyes, then opened them wide. He'd never seen a dragon breathe fire, and he wasn't going to miss seeing it now, especially as it would probably be his last chance. Flames billowed out from the dragon's nose and mouth, The blast from the heat alone nearly knocked Tasselhoff off the chain, but once again, the fire burned all around him and did not touch him. Fizban cackled with delight. "Quite clever, old man," said the dragon angrily. "But I too am a magic user, and I feel you weakening. I hope your cleverness amuses you. All the way down!" Flames flared out again, but this time the dragon's fire was not aimed at the trembling figures clinging to the chain. The flames struck the chain itself, and the iron links began to glow red hot at the first touch of the dragon fire. Pyros breathed again, and the links burned white hot. The dragon breathed a third time. The links melted. The massive chain gave a great shudder and broke, plunging into the darkness below. Pyros watched as it plummeted down. Then, satisfied that the spies would not live to tell their tale, he flew back to his lair, where he could hear Verminard shouting for him. In the darkness, left behind by the dragon, the great cog wheel, free of the chain that had held it in place for centuries, gave a groan and began to turn. Chapter 14. Matterfleur, the magic sword, white feathers. Light from Marita's torch illuminated a large, barren, windowless room. There was no furniture. The only objects in the chill stone chamber were a huge basin of water, a bucket filled with what smelled like rotten meat, and a dragon. Tanis caught his breath. He had thought the black dragon in Zakhtsaroth formidable. He was truly awed at the massive size of this red dragon. Her lair was enormous, probably over 100 feet in diameter, and the dragon stretched the length of it, the tip of her long tail lying against the far wall. For a moment, the companions stood stunned, with ghastly visions of the giant head rising up and searing them with the burning flame breathed by the red dragons, the flames that had destroyed Solace. Marita did not appear worried, however. She advanced steadily into the room, and after a moment's hesitation, the companions hurried after her. As they drew closer to the creature, they could see that Marita had been right. The dragon was clearly in pitiful condition. The great head that lay on the cold stone floor was lined and wrinkled with age. The brilliant red skin, grayish and mottled. She breathed noisily through her mouth. Her jaws parted to reveal the once sword-sharp teeth, now yellowed and broken. Long scars ran along her sides. Her leathery wings were dry and cracked. Now Tanis could understand Marita's attitude. Clearly the dragon had been ill-used, and he caught himself feeling pity, relaxing his guard. He realized how dangerous this was when the dragon, awakened by the torchlight, stirred in her sleep. Her talons were as sharp, and her fire as destructive as any other red dragon on Kryn, Tanis reminded himself sharply. The dragon's eyes opened, slits of glistening red in the torchlight. The companions halted, hands on their weapons.
"Is it time for breakfast already, Marita?"
Matterfleur, Flamestrike being her name to common mortals, said in a sleepy, husky voice.
"Yes, we're just a bit early today, dearie,"
Marita said soothingly.
"but there's a storm brewing, and I want the children to have their exercise before it breaks. Go back to sleep. I'll see they don't wake you on their way out."
"I don't mind."
The dragon yawned and opened her eyes a bit further. Now Tanis could see that one of them had a milky covering. She was blind in that eye. "I hope we don't have to fight her, Tanis," Sturm whispered. It'd be like fighting someone's grandmother. Tanis forced his expression to harden. She's a deadly grandmother, Sturm. Just remember that.
The little ones had a restful night.
The dragon murmured, apparently drifting off to sleep again.
See that they don't get wet if it does storm, Marita. Especially little Eric. He had a cold last week.
Her eyes closed. Turning, Marita beckoned the others on, putting her finger to her lips. Sturm and Tanis came last, their weapons and armor muffled by numerous cloaks and skirts. Tanis was about 30 feet from the dragon's head when the noise started. At first, he thought it was his imagination, that his nervousness was making him hear a buzzing sound in his head. But the sound grew louder, and Sturm turned, staring at him in alarm. The buzzing sound increased until it was like 1,000 swarming locusts. Now the others were looking back too, all of them staring at him. Tanis looked at his friends, helplessly, an almost comic look of confusion on his face. The dragon snorted and stirred in irritation, shaking her head as though the noise hurt her ears. Suddenly, Raceland broke from the group and ran back to Tanis. "The sword!" he hissed. He grabbed the half-elf's cloak and threw it back to reveal the blade. Tanis stared down at the sword in its antique scabbard. The mage was right. The blade hummed as if in the highest state of alarm. Now that Raceland called his attention to it, the half-elf could actually feel the vibrations. "Magic," the mage said softly, studying it with interest. "Can you stop it?" yelled Tanis over the weird noise. "No," said Raceland. "I remember now. This is the Worm Slayer, the famed magical sword of Kithcanon. It is reacting to the presence of the dragon. This is an abysmal time to remember," Tanis said in a fury. "Or a very convenient time," snarled Sturm. The dragon slowly raised her head, her eyes blinking, a thin stream of smoke drifting from a nostril. She focused her bleary red eyes on Tanis, pain and irritation in her gaze. "Who have you brought, Marita?" Matafleur's voice was filled with menace. "I hear a sound I have not heard in centuries. I smell the foul smell of steel. These are not the women. These are warriors."
Don't hurt her,
Marita wailed. "I may not have any choice," Tanis said viciously, drawing Worm Slayer from its sheath. "Riverwind and Gold Moon, get Marita out of here." The blade began to shine with a brilliant white light as the buzzing grew louder and angrier. Matafleur shrank back. The light of the sword pierced her good eye painfully. The terrible sound went through her head like a spear. Whimpering, she huddled away from Tanis. "Run! Get the children!" Tanis yelled, realizing that they didn't need to fight, at least not yet. Holding the shining sword high in the air, he moved forward cautiously, driving the pitiful dragon back against the wall. Marita, after one fearful glance at Tanis, led Gold Moon to the children's room. About 100 children were wide-eyed with alarm over the strange sounds outside their chamber. Their faces relaxed at the sight of Marita and Gold Moon, and a few of the littler ones actually giggled when Caraman came rushing in, his skirts flapping around his armored legs. But at the sight of warriors and their drawn weapons, the children sobered immediately. "What is it, Marita?" asked the oldest girl. "What's happening? Is it fighting again?" "We hope there'll be no fighting, dear one," Marita said softly. "But I'll not lie to you. It may come to that. So I want you to gather your things, particularly your warm clothes, and come with us. The older of you carry the wee ones, as you do when we go outdoors for exercise." Sturm expected confusion and wailing and demands for explanation. But the children quickly did as they were told, wrapping themselves in warm clothing and helping to dress the younger ones. They were quiet and calm, if a bit pale. These were children of war, Sturm remembered. I want you to move very swiftly through the dragon's lair and out into the playroom. When we get there, the big man, Sturm gestured to Caravan, will lead you out into the courtyard. Your mothers are waiting for you there. When you get outside, look immediately for your mother and go to her. Does everyone understand? He glanced dubiously at the smaller children, but the girl at the front of the line nodded.
We understand, sir,
she said. All right. Sturm turned. Caraman. The warrior, flushing in embarrassment as 100 pairs of eyes turned to look at him, led the way back into the dragon's lair. Gold Moon scooped up a toddler in her arms. Marita picked up another one. The older boys and girls carried little ones on their backs. They hurried out the door in orderly fashion, without saying a word, until they saw Tanis, the gleaming sword, and the terrified dragon.
Hey, you! Don't hurt our dragon!
One little boy yelled, leaving his place in line. The child ran up to Tanis, his fists raised, his face twisted into a snarl.
Dougal!
Cried the oldest girl, shocked.
Get back in line this instant!
But some of the children were crying now. Tanis, the sword still raised, knowing that this was the only thing keeping the dragon at bay, shouted, Get them out of here! Children, please. Chieftain's daughter, her voice stern and commanding, brought order to the chaos. Tanis will not hurt the dragon if he does not have to. He is a gentle man. You must leave. Your mothers need you. There was an edge of fear in Gold Moon's voice, a feeling of urgency that influenced even the youngest child. They got back into line quickly.
Goodbye, Flamestrike.
Several of the children called out, wistfully, waving their hands as they followed Karen. Dougal gave Tanis one final threatening glance. Then he returned to line, wiping his eyes with grubby fists. No, shrieked Matafleur in a heartbroken voice. No, don't fight my children, please. It is me you want. Fight me, don't harm my children. Tanis realized the dragon was back in her past, reliving whatever terrible event had deprived her of her children. Sturm stayed near Tanis. She's going to kill you when the children are out of danger, you know. Yes, said Tanis grimly. Already the dragon's eyes, even the bad eye, were flaring red. Saliva dripped from the great, gaping mouth, and her talons scratched the floor. Not my children, she said with rage. I'm with you, Sturm began, drawing his sword. Leave us, knight. Raceland whispered softly from the shadows. Your weapon is useless. I will stay with Tanis. The half-elf glanced at the mage in astonishment. Raceland's strange golden eyes met his, knowing what he was thinking. Do I trust him? Raceland gave him no help, almost as if he were goading him to refusal. Get out, Tanis said to Sturm. What? He yelled. Are you crazy? You're trusting this? Get out, Tanis repeated. At that moment, he heard Flint yelling loudly. Go, Sturm! They need you out there! The knight stood a moment, irresolute, but he could not, in honor, ignore a direct order from one he considered his commander. Casting a baleful glance at Raceland, Sturm turned on his heel and entered the tunnel. There is little magic I can work against a red dragon, Raceland whispered swiftly. Can you buy us time? Tanis asked. Raceland smiled, the smile of one who knows death is so near it is past fearing. I can, he whispered. Move back near the tunnel. when you hear me start to speak, run. Tanis began backing up, still holding the sword high. But the dragon no longer feared its magic. She knew only that her children were gone, and she must kill those responsible. She lunged directly at the warrior with the sword as he began to run toward the tunnel. Then darkness descended upon her. The darkness so deep, Mantifleur thought for a horrible moment she had lost the sight of the other eye. She heard whispered words of magic and knew the robed human had cast a spell. "I'll burn them!" she howled, sniffing the smell of steel through the tunnel. "They will not escape!" But just as she sucked in a great breath, she heard another sound. The sound of her children. "No," she realized in frustration. "I dare not. My children. I might harm my children." Her head drooped down on the cold stone floor. Tanis and Raceland ran down the tunnel, the half-elf dragging the weakened mage with him. Behind them, they heard a pitiful, heartbroken moan. "Not my children. Please, fight me. Don't hurt my children." Tanis emerged from the tunnel into the playroom. Blinking in the bright light, swung the huge door into the rising sun. The children raced out the door into the courtyard. Through the door, Tanis could see Tika and Lorana standing with their swords drawn, looking their way anxiously. The Draconian lay crumbling on the floor of the playroom, Flint's battle axe stuck in its back. "Outside, all of you!" Tanis shouted. Flint, retrieving his battle axe, joined the half-elf as the last to leave the playroom. As they did so, they heard a terrifying roar, the roar of a dragon, but a very different dragon than the pitiful Mantifleur. Pyros had discovered the spies. The stone walls began to tremble. The dragon was rising from her lair. "Ember!" Tanis swore bitterly. "He hasn't gone." The dwarf shook his head. "I'll bet my beard," he said gloomily, "that Tasselhoff's involved." The broken chain plummeted to the stone floor of the chain room in the Slaamori. 3 little figures falling with it. Tasselhoff, clinging uselessly to the chain, tumbled through the darkness and thought, "This is how it feels to die." It was an interesting sensation, and he was sorry he couldn't experience it longer. Above him, he could hear Seston shrieking in terror. Below, he heard the old mage muttering to himself, probably trying one last spell. Then, Fizban raised his voice. "Feather." The word was cut off with a scream. There was the sound of a bone-crushing thud as the old magician crashed to the floor. Tasselhoff grieved, even though he knew he was next. The stone floor was approaching. Within a very few seconds, he, too, would be dead. Then it was snowing. At least, that was what the Kender thought. Then he realized, with a shock, that he was surrounded by millions and millions of feathers, like an explosion of chickens. He sank into a deep, vast pile of white feathers, Seston tumbling in after him. "Poor Fizban," Tass said, blinking tears from his eyes as he floundered in an ocean of white chicken feathers. "His last spell must have been Featherfall, like Raceland uses. Wouldn't you know it? He just got the feathers." Above him, the cogwheel turned faster and faster, the freed chain rushing through it, as if rejoicing in its release from bondage. Outdoors in the courtyard, chaos reigned. "Over here!" Tanis yelled, bursting out of the door, knowing they were doomed but refusing to give in. The companions gathered around him, weapons drawn, looking at him anxiously. Run to the mines. Run for shelter. Verminard and the Red Dragon didn't lead. It is a trap. They'll be on us any moment. The others, their faces grim, nodded. All of them knew it was hopeless. They must cover about 200 yards of flat, wide-open surface to reach safety. They tried to herd the women and children along as swiftly as possible, but not very successfully. All the mothers and children needed to be sorted out. Then Tanis, looking over at the mines, swore aloud in added frustration. The men of the mines, seeing their families free, quickly overpowered the guards and began running toward the courtyard. That wasn't the plan. What was Elistan thinking about? Within moments, there would be 800 frantic people milling around, out in the open, without a scrap of shelter. He had to get them to head back south to the mountains. "Where's Eben?" he called to Sturm. "Last I saw him, he was running for the mines. I couldn't figure out why." The knight and the half-elf gasped in sudden realization. "Of course," said Tanis softly, his voice lost in the commotion. "It all fits." As Eben ran for the mines, his one thought was to obey Pyros' command. Somehow, in the midst of this fury, he had to find the green gemstone man. He knew what Verminard and Pyros were going to do to these poor wretches. Eben felt a moment's pity. He was not, after all, cruel and vicious. He had simply seen, long ago, which side was bound to win. And he determined, for once, to be on a winning side. When his family's fortune was wiped out, Eben was left with only one thing to sell: himself. He was intelligent, handy with a sword, and as loyal as money could buy. It was on a journey to the north, looking for possible buyers, that Eben met Verminard. Eben had been impressed with Verminard's power, and had wormed his way into the evil cleric's favor. But more importantly, he had managed to make himself useful to Pyros. The dragon found Eben charming, intelligent, resourceful, and, after a few tests, trustworthy. Eben was sent home to Gateway just before the dragon army struck. He conveniently escaped and started his resistance group. Stumbling upon Gilthanas's party of elves the first time they tried to sneak into Pax Thargus was a stroke of luck that further improved Eben's relationship with both Pyros and Verminard. When the cleric actually fell into Eben's hands, he couldn't believe his luck. It must go to show how much the Dark Queen favored him, he supposed. He prayed that the Dark Queen continued to favor him. Finding the green gemstone man in this confusion was going to take divine intervention. Hundreds of men were milling about uncertainly. Eben saw a chance to do Verminard another favor. "Tanis wants you men to meet in the courtyard," he cried. "Join your families." "No, that isn't the plan," Elistan cried, trying to stop them. But he was too late. The men, seeing their families free, surged forward. Several hundred gully dwarves added to the confusion, rushing gleefully out of the mines to join the fun, thinking, perhaps, it was a holiday. Eben scanned the crowd anxiously for the green gemstone man, then decided to look inside the prison cells. Sure enough, he found the man sitting alone, staring vaguely around the empty cell. Eben swiftly knelt beside him, racking his brain to come up with the man's name. It was something odd, old-fashioned. "Baron," Eben said after a moment. "Baron." The man looked up, interest lighting his face for the first time in many weeks. He was not, as Durga had assumed, deaf and dumb. He was instead a man obsessed, totally absorbed in his own secret quest. He was human, however, and the sound of a human voice speaking his name was inordinately comforting. Baron, said Evan again, licking his lips nervously. Now that he had him, he wasn't sure what to do with him. He knew the first thing those poor wretches outside would do when the dragon struck would be to head for the safety of the mines. He had to get the Baron out of here before Tanis caught them. But where? He could take the man inside Pax Tharkas as Pyros had ordered, but Evan didn't like that idea. Verminard would certainly find them, and, his suspicions aroused, would ask questions Evan couldn't answer. No. There was only one place Evan could take him and be safe, outside the walls of Pax Tharkas. They could lie low in the wilderness until the confusion died, then sneak back inside the fortress at night. His decision made, Evan took Baron's arm and helped the man rise to his feet. There's going to be fighting, he said. I'm going to take you away, keep you safe until it is over. I am your friend. You understand? The man regarded him with a look of penetrating wisdom and intelligence. It was not the ageless look of the elves, but of a human who has lived in torment for countless years. Baron gave a small sigh and nodded. Verminard strode from his chamber in a fury, yanking at his leather, armored gloves. A Draconian trotted behind him, carrying the High Lord's mace, Nightbringer. Other Draconians milled around, acting on the orders Verminard gave as he stepped into the corridor, returning to Pyros' lair. No, you fools! Don't recall the army! This will take but a moment of my time. Wallanaestir will be in flames by nightfall. Remember! He shouted, throwing open the doors that led to the dragon's lair. He stepped out onto the ledge, peering upward toward the balcony. He could see smoke and flame, and, in the distance, hear the dragon's roar. Ember! There was no answer. How long does it take to capture a handful of spies? He demanded furiously. Turning, he nearly fell over a Draconian captain. Will you be using the dragon's saddle, my lord? No, there isn't time. Besides, I use that only for combat, and there will be no one to fight out there, simply a few hundred slaves to burn. But the slaves have overcome the guards at the mine and are rejoining their families in the courtyard. How strong are your forces? Not nearly strong enough, my lord, the Draconian captain said, its eyes glinting. The captain had never thought it wise to deplete the garrison. We are 40 or 50, perhaps, to over 300 men and an equal number of women. The women will undoubtedly fight alongside the men, your lordship, and if they ever get organized and escape into the mountains. Bah! Ember! Verminard called. He heard, in another part of the fortress, a heavy metallic thud. Then he heard another sound, the great wheel, unused in centuries, creaking with protest at being forced into labor. Verminard was wondering what these odd sounds portended when Pyros flew down into his lair. The Dragon High Lord ran to the ledge as Pyros dropped past him. Verminard climbed swiftly and skillfully onto the dragon's back. Though separated by mutual distrust, the two fought well together. Their hatred for the petty races they strove to conquer, combined with their desire for power, joined them in a bond much stronger than either cared to admit. Fly! Verminard roared, and Pyros rose into the air. It is useless, my friend, Tanis said quietly to Sturm, laying his hand on the knight's shoulder as Sturm frantically called for order. You're only wasting your breath. Save it for fighting. There'll be no fighting. Sturm coughed, hoarse from shouting. We'll die, trapped like rats. Why won't these fools listen? He and Tanis stood at the northern end of the courtyard, about 20 feet from the front gates of Pax Tharkas. Looking south, they could see the mountains and hope. Behind them were the great gates of the fortress that would at any moment open to admit the vast Draconian army. And within these walls, somewhere, were Verminard and the Red Dragon. In vain, Elistan sought to calm the people and urge them to move southward. But the men insisted on finding their womenfolk, and women on finding their children. A few families, together again, were starting to move south, but too late and too slowly. Then, like a blood-red flaming comet, Pyro soared from the fortress of Pax Tharkus, his wings sleek, held close to his sides. His huge tail trailed behind him. His taloned forefeet were curled close to his body as he gained speed in the air. Upon his back rode the Dragon High Lord, the gilded horns of the hideous dragon mask glinting in the morning sun. Verminard held on to the dragon's spiny mane with both hands as they flared into the sunlit sky, bringing night's shadows to the courtyard below. The dragon fear spread over the people. Unable to scream or run, they could only cower before the fearful apparition, arms around each other, knowing death was inevitable. At Verminard's command, Pyros settled on one of the fortress towers. Verminard stared out from behind the horned dragon mask, silent, furious. Tanis, watching in helpless frustration, felt Sturm grip his arm. Look. The knight pointed north, toward the gates. Tanis reluctantly lowered his gaze from the Dragon High Lord and saw two figures running toward the gates of the fortress. Eben, he cried in disbelief. But who's that with him? He won't escape, Sturm shouted. Before Tanis could stop him, the knight ran after the two. As Tanis followed, he saw a flash of red out of the corner of his eye, Raistlin and his twin. I, too, have a score to settle with this man, the mage hissed. The three caught up with Sturm just as the knight gripped Eben by the collar and hurled him to the ground. Traitor! Sturm yelled loudly. Though I die this day, I'll send you to the abyss first. He drew his sword and jerked Eben's head back. Suddenly, Eben's companion whirled around, came back, and caught hold of Sturm's sword arm. Sturm gasped. His hand loosened its grip on Eben as the knight stared, amazed at the sight before him. The man's shirt had been torn open in his wild flight from the mines. Impaled in the man's flesh, in the center of his chest, was a brilliant green jewel. Sunlight flashed on the gem that was as big around as a man's fist, causing it to gleam with a bright and terrible light, an unholy light. I have never seen nor heard of magic like this, Raistlin whispered in awe as he and the others stopped, stunned, beside Sturm. Seeing their wide eyes focused on his body, Beram instinctively pulled his shirt over his chest, then loosened his hold on Sturm's arm. He turned and ran for the gates. Eben scrambled to his feet and stumbled after him. Sturm leaped forward, but Tanis stopped him. No, he said. It's too late. We have others to think of. Tanis, look! Caramin shouted, pointing above the huge gates. A section of the stone wall of the fortress above the massive front gates began to open, forming a huge, widening crack. Slowly at first, then with increasing speed, the massive granite boulders began to fall from the crack, smashing to the ground with such force that the flagstone cracked and great clouds of dust rose into the air. Above the roar could be dimly heard the sound of the massive chains releasing the mechanism. The boulders began to fall just as Eben and Beram arrived at the gates. Eben shrieked in terror, instinctively and pitifully raised his arm to shield his head. The man next to him glanced up and, it seemed, gave a small sigh. Then both were buried under tons of cascading rock as the ancient defense mechanism sealed shut the gates of Pax Tharkus.
This is your final act of defiance!
Verminard roared. His speech had been interrupted by the fall of the rocks, an act that only enraged him more.
I offered you a chance to work to further the glory of my queen. I cared for you and your families. But you are stubborn and foolish. You will pay with your lives.
The dragon High Lord raised Nightbringer high in the air.
I will destroy the men. I will destroy the women. I will destroy the children.
At a touch of the dragon High Lord's hand, Pyros spread his huge wings and leaped high into the air. The dragon drew in a deep breath, preparing to swoop down upon the mass of people who wailed in terror in the wide-open courtyard and incinerate them with his fiery breath. But the dragon's deadly dive was stopped. Sweeping up into the sky from the pile of rubble made when she crashed out of the fortress, Matafleur flew straight at Pyros. The ancient dragon had sunk deeper into her madness. Once more she relived the nightmare of losing her children. She could see the knights upon the silver and golden dragons, the wicked Dragonlances gleaming in the sunshine. In vain, she pleaded with her children not to join the hopeless fight. In vain, she sought to convince them the war was at an end. They were young and would not listen. They flew off, leaving her weeping in her lair. As she watched in her mind's eye the bloody final battle, as she saw her children die upon the Dragonlances, she heard Verminard's voice.
I will destroy the children.
And, as she had done so many centuries before, Matafleur flew out to defend them. Pyros, stunned by the unexpected attack, swerved just in time to avoid the broken yet still lethal teeth of the old dragon, aiming for his unprotected flanks. Matafleur hit him a glancing blow, tearing painfully into one of the heavy muscles that drove the giant wings. Rolling in the air, Pyros lashed out at the passing Matafleur with a wicked, taloned forefoot, tearing a gash in the female dragon's soft underbelly. In her madness, Matafleur did not even feel the pain, but the force of the larger and younger male dragon's blow knocked her backwards in the air. The rollover maneuver had been an instinctive defensive action on the part of the male dragon. He had been able to gain both altitude and time to plan his attack. He had, however, forgotten his rider. Verminard, riding without the dragon saddle he used in battle, lost his grip on the dragon's neck and fell to the courtyard below. It was not a long drop, and he landed, uninjured, only bruised and momentarily shaken. Most of the people around him fled in terror when they saw him rise to his feet, but, glancing around swiftly, he noticed that there were 4 near the northern end of the courtyard who did not flee. He turned to face those 4. The appearance of Matafleur and her sudden attack on Pyros jolted the captive people out of their state of panic. This, combined with the fall of Verminard into their midst, like the fall of some horrifying god, accomplished what Elistan and the others had not. The people were shaken out of their fear, sense returned, and they began fleeing south toward the safety of the mountains. At this sight, the Draconian captain sent his forces pouring into the crowd. He detailed another messenger, a wyvern, to fly from the fortress to recall the army. The Draconians surged into the refugees, but if they hoped to cause a panic, they had failed. The people had suffered enough. They had allowed their freedom to be taken away once in return for the promise of peace and safety. Now they understood that there could be no peace as long as these monsters roamed Kryn. The people of Solace and Gateway, men, women, and children, fought back using every pitiful weapon they could grab, rocks, stones, their own bare hands, teeth, and nails. The companions became separated in the crowd. Lorana was cut off from everyone. Gilthanas had tried to stay near her, but he was carried off in the mob. The elf maiden, more frightened than she believed possible, and longing to hide, fell back against the wall of the fortress, her sword in her hand. As she watched the raging battle in horror, a man fell to the ground in front of her, clutching his stomach, his fingers red with his own blood, his eyes fixed in death, seeming to stare at her as his blood formed a pool at her feet. Lorana stared at the blood in horrid fascination. Then she heard a sound in front of her. Shaking, she looked up directly into the hideous reptilian face of the man's killer. The Draconian, seeing an apparently terror-stricken elven female before him, figured on an easy kill. Licking its blood-stained sword with its long tongue, the creature jumped over the body of his victim and lunged for Lorana. Clutching her sword, her throat aching with terror, Lorana reacted out of sheer defensive instinct. She stabbed blindly, jabbing upward. The Draconian was caught totally off guard. Lorana plunged her weapon into the Draconian's body, feeling the sharp elven blade penetrate both armor and flesh, hearing bones splinter, and the creature's last gurgling scream. It turned to stone, yanking the sword from her hand. But Lorana, thinking with a cold detachment that amazed her, knew from hearing the warriors talk that if she waited a moment, the stone body would turn to dust, releasing her weapon. The sounds of battle raged around her. The screams, the death cries, the thuds and groans, the clash of steel. But she heard none of it. She waited calmly until she saw the body crumble. Then she reached down and, sifting the dust aside with her hand, she grasped the hilt of her sword and lifted it into the air. Sunlight flashed on the blood-stained blade. Her enemy lay dead at her feet. She looked around but could not see Tanis. She could not see any of the others. For all she knew, they might be dead. For all she knew, she might herself be dead within the next moment. Lorana lifted her eyes to the sun-drenched blue sky. The world she might soon be leaving seemed newly made. Every object, every stone, every leaf stood out in painful clarity. A warm, fragrant southern breeze sprang up, driving back the storm clouds that hung over her homeland to the north. Lorana's spirit, released from its prison of fear, soared higher than the clouds. And her
Cheers,
sword
Christopher.
flashed in the
Hope
morning
you're doing
sun.
good.
The morning sun. Chapter 15. The Dragon High Lord. Matafleur's children. Verminard studied the four men as they approached him. These were not slaves, he realized. Then he recognized them as the ones who traveled with the golden-haired cleric. These then were the ones who had defeated Onyx in Zakhtsaroth, escaped the slave caravan, and broken into Paxthon.
Bravo, Chris. J'espère que tu vas bien.
Not much, just chilling.
He felt as if he knew them, the knight from that broken land of past glories, a half-elf trying to pass himself off as human, a deformed, sickly magician, and the mage's twin.
Pas grand-chose, juste pour me détendre.
Win. A human giant whose brain was probably as thick as his arms. It will be an interesting fight, he thought. He almost welcomed hand-to-hand combat. It had been a long time. He was growing
Give me
bored
1
with
second.
commanding armies from the back of a dragon. Thinking of Ember, he glanced into the sky, wondering if he might be able to summon aid. But it appeared that the red dragon was having his own problems. Matafla had been fighting battles when Pyros was still in the air. What she lacked in strength, she made up for in guile and cunning. The air crackled with flames. Dragon blood dropped down like red rain. Shrugging, Verminard looked back at the four approaching him warily. He could hear the magic user reminding his companions that Verminard was the spirit of the Queen of Darkness and, as such, could call upon her aid. Verminard knew from his spies that this magic user, though young, was imbued with a strange power and considered very dangerous. The four did not speak. There was no need for talk among these men, nor was there need for talk between enemies. Respect, grudging as it may be, was apparent on both sides. As for the battle, that was unnecessary. This would be fought coolly. The major would be dead. And so the four came forward, spreading to outflank him, since he had nothing to set his back against. Crouching low, Verminard swung Nightbringer in an arc, keeping them back, forming his plans. He must even the odds. Gripping Nightbringer in his right hand, the evil cleric sprang forward from his crouched stance with all the strength in his powerful legs. His sudden move took his opponents by surprise. He did not raise his mace. All he needed now was his deadly touch. Landing on his feet in front of Raceland, he reached out and grasped the magic user by the shoulder, whispering a sweet prayer to his dark queen. Raceland screamed. His body pierced by unseen, unholy weapons, he sank to the ground in agony.
Give me 1 second. I'll be right back.
Simon gave a great, bellowing roar and sprang at Verminard. But the cleric was prepared. He swung the mace, Nightbringer, and struck the warrior a glancing blow. Midnight, Verminard whispered, and Caraman's bellow changed to a shout of panic as the spellbound mace blinded him.
I can't see, Tanis. Help me!
The big warrior cried, stumbling about. Verminard, laughing grimly, struck him a solid blow to the head. Caraman went down like a felled ox. Out of the corner of his eye, Verminard saw the half-elf leap for him, a two-handed sword of ancient elvish design in his hands. Verminard whirled, blocking Tanis' sword with Nightbringer's massive oaken handle. For a moment, the two combatants were locked together. But Verminard's greater strength won out, and he hurled Tanis to the ground. The Salamnic knight raised his sword in salute. A costly mistake. It gave Verminard time to remove a small iron needle from a hidden pocket. Raising it, he called once more upon the Queen of Darkness to defend her cleric. Stern, striding forward, suddenly felt his body grow heavier and heavier, until he could walk no more. Tanis, lying on the ground, felt an unseen hand press down on him. He couldn't move. He couldn't turn his head. His tongue was too thick to speak. He could hear Raceland scream and choke off in pain. He could hear Verminard laugh and shout a hymn of praise to the Dark Queen. Tanis could only watch in despair as the dragon, High Lord, mace raised, walked towards Stern, preparing to end the night's life.
Enemies, Karas!
Verminard said in Solan. He lifted the mace in a gruesome mockery of the knight's salute, then aimed for the knight's head, knowing that this death would be the most torturous possible for a knight. Dying, at the mercy of an enemy. Suddenly, a hand caught Verminard's wrist. In astonishment, he stared at the hand of a female. He felt a power to match his own, a holiness to match his unholiness. At her touch, Verminard's concentration wavered, his prayers to his dark queen faltered. Then it was that the dark queen herself looked up to find
How's your night going, Chris?
dressed in white and shining armor, appear on the horizon of her plans. She was not ready to fight this god. She had not expected his return, and so she fled to rethink her options and restructure her battle, seeing, for the first time, the possibility. The Queen of Darkness withdrew and left her carefully to his feet. Stern felt the spell leave his body, his muscles his own to command once more. He saw Verminard turn his fury on Gold Moon, striking at her savagely. The knight lunged forward, seeing Tannis rise, the elven sword flashing in the sunlight. Both men ran toward Gold Moon, but Riverwind was there before them, thrusting her out of the way. The plainsman received on his sword the blow of the cleric's mace that had been intended to crush Gold Moon's head. Riverwind heard the cleric shout, "Midnight!" and his vision was obscured by the same unholy darkness that had overtaken Caramel. But the Guishu warrior, expecting this, did not panic. Riverwind could still hear his enemy. Resolutely ignoring the pain of his injury, he transferred the sword to his left hand and stabbed it into his enemy's heart. The blade, dragon was jarred from Riverwind's. Riverwind
Cheers to Chris.
though he knew it was hopeless. But at that moment, Verminard realized he was alone, bereft of spiritual help. He felt the cold, skeletal hand of despair clutching him, and he called to his dark queen. She had turned away, absorbed in her own struggle. Verminard began to sweat beneath the Dragonlance. He cursed it as the helm seemed to stifle him. He cursed it. Too late he realized its unsuitableness for hand-to-hand combat. The mask blocked his peripheral vision. He saw the blind and wounded before him. He could kill him at his leisure. But there were two other fighters near. The knight and the half-elf had been freed of the unholy spell he had cast on them. They were coming closer. He could hear them. Catching a glimpse of movement, he turned quickly and saw the half-elf running toward the elvish blaze. Listen. But where was the knight? Verminard turned and backed up, swinging his mace to keep them at bay, while with his free hand he struggled to rip the dragon helm from his head. Just as Verminard's hand closed over the visor, the magic blade of Kip's hand pierced his armor and slid into his back. The Dragon High Lord screamed and whirled in rage, only to see the Solamnic Knight appear in his blood-dimmed vision. The ancient blade of Sturm's fathers plunged into his bowels. Verminard fell to his knees. Still, he struggled to remove the helm. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't see. He felt another sword thrust. Then, darkness overtook him. High overhead, weakened by loss of blood and many wounds, heard the voices of her children crying to her. She was confused and disoriented. Pyros seemed to be attacking from every direction at once. Then the big red dragon was before her, against the wall of the
Do
mountain.
one more.
Not a saw her chance. She would save her children. Pyros breathed a great blast of flame directly into the face of the ancient red dragon. He watched in satisfaction as their head withered, the eyes melted. But Matafleur ignored the flames that seared her eyes, forever ending her vision, and flew straight at the pirates. The big male dragon, his mind clouded by fury and pain and thinking he had finished his enemy, was taken by surprise. Even as he breathed again his death, he realized with horror the position he was in. He had allowed Matafleur to maneuver him between herself and the sheer face of the mountain. He had nowhere to go, no room to turn. Matafleur soared into him with all the force of his powerful body, striking him with a spear. Both hands slammed against the mountain. The peak trembled and split apart as the face of the mountain exploded in flames. In later years, when the death of Flamestrike was legend, there were those who claimed to have heard a dragon's voice fade away like smoke on an autumn wind, whispering, "My children." The wedding. The last day of autumn dawned clear and bright. The air was warm, touched by the fragrance.
Je ne vais pas trop mal, je ne peux pas me plaindre.
Touched by the fragrant wind from the south, which had blown steadily ever since the refugees fled Pax Thorns, taking with them only what they
I'm
had
alive.
from the fortress as they fled the
Other than that,
of
can't
the
complain,
Dragonlance.
I guess.
It had taken long days for the Draconian army to scale the walls of Pax Thorns, its gates blocked by boulders, its towers defended by gully dwarves. Led by Seston, the gully dwarves stood on top of the walls, throwing rocks, dead rats, and occasionally each other down on the frustrated Draconians. This allowed the refugees time to escape into the mountains where, although they skirmished with small forces of Draconians, they were not seriously threatened. Flint volunteered to lead a party of men through the mountains, searching for a place where the people could spend the winter. These mountains were familiar to Flint, since the Hill Dwarfs' homeland was not far to the south.
How are you
Flint's
been,
party
Chris?
discovered a valley nestled between vast, craggy peaks,
Christopher.
whose treacherous passes were choked with snow in the winter. The passes could be easily held against the might of the dragon armies, and there were caves where they could hide from the fury of the dragons. Following a dangerous path, the refugees fled into the mountains and entered the valley. An avalanche soon blocked the route and destroyed all trace of their passing. It would be months before the Draconians discovered them. The valley, far below the mountain peaks, was warm and sheltered from the harsh winter winds and snows. The woods were filled with game. Clear streams flowed from the mountains. The people mourned their dead, rejoiced in their deliverance, built shelters, and celebrated a wedding. On the last day of autumn, as the sun set behind the mountains, kindling their snow-capped peaks with flame the color of dying dragons, River Wind and Gold Moon were married. When the two came to Elistan to ask him to preside over their exchange of vows, he had been deeply honored, and had asked them to explain the ways of their people to him. Both of them replied steadily that their people were dead. The Quayshu were gone. Their ways were no more. This will be our ceremony. River Wind said. The beginning of something new, not the continuation of that which has passed away. Though we will
Oh, damn, that sucks, Chris. Sorry to hear that.
We must look forward, not behind. We will honor the past by taking from it the good and the sorrowful that have made us what we are. But the past shall rule us no longer. Elistan therefore studied the discs of Mishikal to find what the ancient gods taught about marriage. He asked Gold Moon and Riverwind to write their own vows, searching their hearts for
Putain, c'est nul, désolée d'entendre ça.
searching their hearts for the true meaning of their love. For these vows would be spoken before the gods, and last beyond death. One custom of the Kue Shu the couple kept. This was that the bride gift and the groom gift could not be purchased. This symbol of love must be made by the hand of the beloved. The gifts would be exchanged with the saying of the vows. As the sun's rays spread across the sky, Elistan took his place on the top of a gentle rise. The people gathered in silence at the foot of the hill. From the east came Tika and Lorana, bearing torches. Behind them walked Gold Moon, chieftain's daughter. Her hair fell down around her shoulders in streams of molten gold, mingled with silver. Her head was crowned with autumn leaves. She wore the simple fringed doeskin tunic she had worn through their adventures. The medallion of Michigan glittered her wrist. She carried her bride gift, wrapped in a cloth as fine as copper, for the beloved one's eyes must be the first to see. Tika,
Oh, that sucks, Chris.
solemn, misty-eyed wonder. The young girl's heart filled with dreams of her own, beginning to think that this great mystery shared by men and women might not be the terrifying experience she had feared, but something sweet and beautiful. Lorana, next to Tika, held her torch high, brightening the day's dying light.
No problem,
People
Chris.
noticed Gold Moon's beauty. They fell silent when Lorana passed. Gold Moon was human. Her beauty, the beauty of the trees and mountains and skies. Lorana's beauty was elvish, otherworldly, mysterious. The two women brought the bride to Elistan. Then they turned, looking to the west, waiting for the groom. A blaze of torches lit Riverwind's way. Tanis and Stern, their solemn faces wistful and gentle, lay. Riverwind came behind, towering over the others, his face stern as always. But a radiant joy, brighter than the torches, lit his eyes. His black hair.
Yeah,
was
that
tied
really
over
sucks.
his knees, his groom gift covered by one of Tasselhoff's handkerchiefs. Behind him walked Flynn and the Kendall. Caraman and Raistlin came last, the mage bearing the lighted crystal staff of mages instead of a torch. The men brought the groom to Elistan, then stepped back to join the women. Tika found herself standing next to Caraman, reaching out timidly. She touched his hand. Smiling down at her gently, he clasped her little hand in his big one. As Elistan looked at Riverwind and Gold Moon, he thought of the terrible grief and fear and danger they had faced, the harshness of their lives. Did their future hold anything different? For a moment he was overcome and could not speak. The two, seeing Elistan's emotion and perhaps understanding his sorrow, reached out to him reassuringly. Elistan drew them close to him, whispering words for them alone. It was your love and your faith in each other that brought hope to the world. Each of you was willing to sacrifice your life for this promise of love. Each has saved the life of the other. The sun shines now, but already its rays are dimming.
Give me 1 second. I'll be right back.
It is the same for you, my friend. You will walk through much darkness before morning. Your love will be as a torch the night will. Elistan then stepped back and began to speak to all assembled. His voice, husky to begin, grew stronger and stronger as he felt the peace of the gods surround him and confirm their blessings on this couple. The left hand is the hand of the heart, he said, placing Gold Moon's left hand on Riverwind's left hand, and holding his own left hand over them. We join left hands, the But the love in the hearts of this man and this woman may combine to form something greater, as two streams join together to form a mighty river. The river flows through the land, branching off into tributaries, exploring new ways, yet ever drawn to the eternal sea. Receive their love, Paladin, greatest of the gods. Bless it and grant them peace, at least in their hearts, if there is no peace in this shattered land. In the blessed silence, husbands and wives put their arms around each other. Friends drew close, children quieted, and crept near their parents. Hearts filled with mourning were comforted. Peace was granted. Pledge your vows one to another, Elistan said, and exchange the gifts of your hands and hearts. Gold Moon looked into Riverwind's eyes and began to speak softly. Wars have settled on the north, and dragons ride the skies. Now is the time for wisdom, say the wise and the nearly wise. Here in the heart of battle, the time to be brave is at hand. Now most things are larger than the promise of woman to man. But you and I, through burning flames, through darkness of the earth, affirm this world, its people, the heavens that gave them birth, the breath that passes between us, this altar where we stand, and all those things made larger by the promise of woman to man. Then Riverwind spoke. Now in the belly of winter, when ground and sky are gray, here in the heart of sleeping snow, now is the time to
Hey,
say
Chris.
yes to this mountain valley, evergreen countries. For these things are far larger than a man's word to his mouth. Through these promises we keep, forged in the yawning night, proved in the presence of heroes and the prospect of spring rain. The children will see moons and stars, where now the dragons ride, and humble things made large by a man's word to his brother. When the vows were spoken, they exchanged gifts. Gold Moon shyly handed her present to Riverwind. He unwrapped it with hands that trembled. It was a ring, plaited of her own hair, bound with bands of silver and of gold as fine as the hair they surrounded. Gold Moon had given Flint their mother's son. The dwarfs had not lost their touch. In the wreckage of swords, Riverwind had found a Valenwood branch spared by the dragon's fire, and had carried in his path. Now that branch made Riverwind's gift to Gold Moon a ring, perfectly smooth and plain. When polished, the wood of the tree was a rich gold color, marked by streaks and whorls of salt.
Yo, shit. Nice. That's a lot of seeds.
Remembered the first night she had seen the great Valenwoods, the night they had stumbled, weird and frightened, into solace, bearing the blue crystal staff. She began to cry softly, and wiped her eyes with Tasse's handkerchief. Bless the gifts, Paladin, Elistan said, these symbols of love and sacrifice. Grant that during times of deepest darkness, these two may look upon these gifts and see their path lighted by love. Great and shining God, God of human and elf, God of Kender and dwarf, give your blessing to these, your children. May the love they plant in their hearts today be nourished by their souls and grow into a tree of life, providing shelter and protection to all who seek refuge beneath its spreading boughs. With the joining of hands, the exchanging of vows, the giving of gifts, you too, Riverwind.
Bien, ça fait beaucoup de graines.
Riverwind, grandson of Wanderer, and Gold Moon, chieftain's daughter, become one in your hearts, in the sight of men, in the eyes of the gods. Riverwind took his ring from Gold Moon and placed it upon her slender finger. Gold Moon took her ring from Riverwind. He knelt before her, as would have been the custom of the Grey Sheep, but Gold Moon shook her head. "Rise, boy," she said, smiling through her tears. "Is that a command?" he asked softly. "It is the last command of chieftain's daughter," she whispered. Riverwind stood up, placed the golden ring on his finger. Then Riverwind took her in his arms. She put her arms around him, their lips met. Their bodies melded together, their spirits joined. The people gave a great shout, and torches flamed. The sun sank behind the mountains, leaving the sky bathed in a pearl-like hue of purples and soft reds, which soon deepened into the sapphire of night. The bride and groom were carried down the hill by the cheering throng, and feasting and merriment began. Huge tables carved from the pine trees of the forest were set up on the grass. The children, freed at last from the awe of the ceremony, ran and shouted, playing at dragon slaying. Tonight, care and worry were far from their minds. Men broached the huge casks of ale and wine they had salvaged in Pax Tharkas, and began drinking salutes to the bride and groom. Women brought in huge plates of food, game and fruits and vegetables gathered in the forest and taken from the stores in Pax Tharkas.
Cheers to you too,
"Get out
Chris.
of my way, don't crowd me," Caraman grumbled as he sat down at the table. The companions, laughing, moved over to give the big man room. Marita and two other women came forward and placed a huge platter of deer meat before the big warrior. "Real food," sighed the warrior. "Hey!" roared Flynn, stabbing at a piece of sizzling meat on Caraman's plate with his fork. "Eat that?" Caraman promptly and silently, without missing a bite, emptied a flagon of ale over the dwarf's head. Tanis and Sturm sat side by side, talking quietly. Tanis's eyes strayed to Lorana occasionally. She sat at a different table, talking animatedly with Elistan. Tanis, thinking how lovely she looked to them, realized how changed she was from the willful, lovesick girl who had followed him from Guaranese. He told himself he liked the change in her, but he caught himself wondering just what she and Elistan found so interesting. Sturm touched his arm. Tanis started. He had lost track of the conversation. First, he began to apologize when he saw the look on Sturm's face. Tanis said, "Don't move," Sturm ordered. Sitting off to himself. Tanis looked where Sturm
That was a
gestured,
good hit there.
puzzled. Then he saw the man, sitting alone, hunched over his food, eating it absently as if he didn't really taste it. Whenever anyone approached, the man shrank back, eyeing him nervously until he passed. Suddenly, perhaps sensing Tanis's eyes on him, he raised his head and stared directly at him. The half-elf gasped and dropped his fork. "But that's impossible," he said in a strangled voice. "I saw him die. With Ebon. No one could have survived him when I was right." Sturm said grimly. "You recognize me too. I thought I was going mad. Let's go talk to him." But when they looked again, he was gone. Swiftly, they searched the crowd, but it was impossible to find him now. As the silver moon and the red rose in the sky, the married couples formed a ring around the bride and groom and began singing wedding songs. Unmarried couples danced in pairs outside the circle, while the children leaped and shouted and reveled in staying up past their bedtime. Bonfires burned brightly, voices and music filled the night air. The silver moon and the red rose to light the sky. The full moon and bitter wind stood, their arms around each other, their eyes shining brighter than the moon's or the blazing fire. Tanis lingered on the outskirts, watching his friends. Lorana and Gilthanas performed an ancient elvish dance of grace and beauty, singing together a hymn of joy. Sturm and Elistan fell into conversation about their plans to travel south in search of the legendary seaport city of Tarsus the Beautiful, where they hoped to find ships to carry the people from this war-torn land. Tika, tired of watching Caravan eat, teased Flint until the dwarf finally agreed to dance with her, blushing bright red beneath his beard. Where was Raceland? Tanis wondered. The half-elf recalled seeing him at the banquet. The mage ate little and drank his herbal mixture. He had seemed unusually pale and quiet. Tanis decided to go in search of him. The company of the dark-souled, cynical mage seemed more suited to him tonight than music and laughter. Tanis wandered into the moonlit darkness, knowing somehow he was headed in the right direction. He found Raceland sitting on the stump of an old tree, whose lightning-shattered, blackened remains lay scattered over the ground. The half-elf sat down next to the silent mage. A small shadow settled among the trees behind the half-elf. Finally, Tass would hear what these two discussed. Raceland's strange eyes stared into the southlands, barely visible between a gap in the tall mountains. The wind still blew from the south, but it was beginning to veer again. The temperature was falling. Tanis felt Raceland's frail body shiver. Looking at him in the moon, Tanis was startled to see the mage's resemblance to his half-sister.
Damn tooth.
It was a fleeting impression and gone almost as soon as it came, but it brought the woman to Tanis's mind, adding to his feelings of unrest and disquiet. He restlessly tossed a piece of bark back and forth from hand to hand. "What do you see in the sun?" Tanis asked abruptly. Raceland glanced at him. "What do I ever see in these eyes of mine? Half-elf," the mage whispered bitterly. "I see death and destruction. I see war." He gestured up above. "Constellations have not returned. The reign of darkness is not defeated. We may not have won the war," Tanis began. "But surely we have won a major battle." Raceland coughed and shook his head sadly. "You see no hope? Hope is the denial of reality. It is the carrot dangled before the draft horse to keep him plodding along in a vain attempt to reach it." "Are you saying we should just give up?" Tanis asked, irritably, tossing the bark away. "I'm saying we should remove the carrot and walk forward with our eyes open." Raceland answered. Coughing, he drew his robes more closely around him. "How will you fight the dragons, Tanis? For there will be more than you can imagine. And where now is Hugo? Where now is the Dragonlance? No, half-elf, do not talk to me of hope." Tanis did not answer, nor did the mage speak again. Both sat silent, one continuing to stare south, the other glancing up into the great voids in the glittering starlit sky. Tasselhoff sank back into the soft grass
That was
beneath
nasty.
the pine
That was
trees.
cashed.
"No. The Kender repeated bleakly, So he said, staring at the stars. The Kender realized, and the thought filled him with grief. Ever since the death of the old magician, an unnoticed change had come over the Kender. Tasselhoff began to consider that this adventure was in earnest, that it had a purpose for which people gave their lives. He wondered why he was involved and thought he had given the answer to Fizban.
I'm smoking roachweed.
He was meant to do were
It's just a bunch of
some in the big scheme of things. But until now, it had never occurred
just
to him that
let's see.
all this might be for nothing.
The container of roachweed.
That they might suffer.
I got wax.
People they
The wax is
Fizban.
berries and cream,
The
but
dragons would still win.
my smoke is roachweed.
Still, the Kender said so.
But I also have
Trying and hoping. That's what's important. The trying and the hoping. Maybe that's most important of all. Something floated gently down from the sky, rushing past.
but also put a layer of wax on top of the bowl too, so it's roachweed but with all kinds of wax on it.
The Song of Humor was the last, and many consider the greatest work of the elven bard, Gwyvaelin's song. Only fragments of the work remained following the cataclysm. It is said that those who study it diligently will find hints to the future of the turning world. Song of Humor. Out of the village, out of the thatched and clutching shives, out of the grave and furrow and grave, where his sword first tried the last cruel dances of childhood, and awoke to the shives, forever retreating, his greatness a marsh fire, the banked flight of the kingfisher always above him. Now Humo walked upon roses, in the level light of the rose. And troubled by dragons, he turned to the end of the land, to the fringe of all sense and senses, to the wilderness where Paladin bade him to turn, and there, in the loud tunnel of knives,
So it's not too bad. Can't complain on that.
Stunned into himself by a deafening gauntlet.
But that container being filled up the way it is, we have a big old container
at the end
of just roaches
from the shores of creation, and all time staggered at the forest edge where Huma haunted.
This is just my little stash that I've had from when I smoke at night.
For their bounty and keeping. Then saw
and some of what I got from in there.
In the first silence,
but they didn't even make a dent in the stacks of roaches we have.
He lowered the bow, and the world resumed. Then Huma followed the stag, its tangle of antlers receding, as a memory of young light, as the talons of birds ascended. The mountains crouched before him. Nothing would change now. The three moons stomped in the sky, and the long night tumbled in shadows. It was morning when they reached the grove, the lap of the mountain where the stag departed. Nor did Huma follow, knowing the end of this journey was nothing but grief, and the promise of grief that endured in the eyes of the woman before. And holy the days he drew near her, holy the air that carried his words of endearment, his forgotten songs, and the rapt moons knelt in the great mountain. Still she eluded him, bright and retreating as marsh fire, nameless and lovely. She was nameless as they learned that the world, the dazzling shells of the air, the wilderness itself, were plain and diminished things to the heart's thing. At the end of the days, she told him her secret, for she was not a woman, nor was she mortal, but but the daughter and heiress from a line of dragons. For Huma, the sky turned indifferent, cluttered by moons. The brief light of the grass mocked his fathers, and the thorned light bristled in the gliding mountain. But nameless, she tendered a hope not in her keeping, that Paladin only might answer, that through his enduring wisdom she might step from forever, and there, in her silver arms, the promise of the grove might rise and flourish. For that wisdom Huma prayed, and the stag returned, and east, through the desolate fields, through ash, through cinders and blood, the harvest of dragons traveled Huma, cradled by dreams of the silver dragon.
This one too.
Perfected a signal before him. At last, the eventual harbor, a temple so far to the east that it lay where the east was ending. There, Paladin appeared, in a pool of stars and glory, announcing that of all choices, one most terrible had fallen to you. Paladin is a nest of yearning, forever toward life, becoming into the devouring sun. Together they would return to the past and leave behind the secret of the lands, the world unpeopled in darkness, wed to the dragons. Or Huma could take on the Dragonlance, cleansing all Kryn of death and invasion of the green paths of his law. The hardest of choices, and Huma remembered how the wilderness cloistered and baptized his first thoughts beneath the sheltering sun, and now, as the black moon weaved and pivoted, and the substance from Kryn, from the things of Kryn, from the grove, from the mountain, from the abandoned shines, he would sleep. He would send it all away, for the choosing was all of the pain, and the choices were heat on the hand when the arm has been severed. She came to him, weeping and luminous, in a landscape of dreams where he saw the world collapse and renew on the glint of the lands. In her farewell lay collapse and renew. Through his doomed veins, the horizon burst. He took up the Dragonlance. He took up the story. The pale heat rushed through his rising arm, and the sun and the three moons waiting for wonders hung in the sky together. To the west, Huma rode, to the high Clarist's tower, on the back of the silver dragon, and the path of their flight crossed over a desolate country where the dead walked over, mouthing the names of dragons. And the men in the towers surrounded and by dragons, by the cries of the dying.
It's cheaper on the black market than going to the actual store for it around here.
Far worse in fear that the crash of the senses would end in a moment of.
That's why
where the mind
me and my brother both grow, so we don't have to buy.
But the winding of Huma's horn in the distance danced on the battlements. All of Solamnia lifted its face to the eastern sky, and the dragons wheeled to the highest air, believing some terrible change had come. From out of their tumult of wings, out of the chaos of dragons, out of the heart of nothing, the mother of night, a swirl in a blankness of colors, swooped to the east into the stare of the sun, and the sky collapsed into silver and blackness. On the ground, Huma lay. At his side, a woman, her silver skin broken, the promise of green released from the gifts of her eyes. She whispered her name as the Queen of Darkness banked in the sky above Huma. She descended, the mother of night. And from the loft of the battlements, men saw shadows boil on the colorless dime of her wings, a hovel of thatch and rushes, the heart of a wilderness, a lost silver light spattered in terrible crimson. And then, from the center of shadows, came a depth in which darkness itself was a glimmer, denying all air, all light, all shadows, and thrusting his lance into emptiness, Huma fell to the sweetness of death, into abiding sunlight. Through the lance, through the dear might and brotherhood of those who must walk to the end of the breath and the senses, he banished the dragons back to the core of nothing, and the long lands blossomed in fantasy, stunned in new freedom, stunned by the brightness and colors, by the heart blessing of the holy winds. The knights carried Huma. They carried the Dragonlance to the grove in the lap of the mountain. When they returned to the grove in pilgrimage, in homage, the lance, the arm, the dragon-bane himself had vanished to the day's eye. But the night of the full moon's red and silver.
Oh shit. Not us. Today we're going to be in,
on the forms of a man,
I think the 80s.
and a woman,
That's in Fahrenheit.
steel and silver, silver and steel, above the village, over the thatched and nurturing shop.
We need some rain over here.
This book is over, but the story continues. Keep
Uh-oh.
listening after the credits to hear the beginning of Dragons of Winter Night, Book 2.
That was a good book. Definitely you have to get book 2 in the series. What to put until then. At least for the rest of the night, anyways.
It was 10 times as big as Bearlawn. 50 times as big. Matt nodded. A city, he agreed. But what's a city doing in the middle of a forest like this? And without people, Barrett said. When they looked at him, he pointed to the wall. Would people let vines grow over everything like that? You know how creepers can tear down a wall. Look how it's fallen. What Rand saw adjusted itself in his mind again. It was as Perrin said. Under almost every low space in the wall was a brush-covered hill, rubble from the collapsed wall above. No two of the guard towers were the same height. I wonder what city it was, Egwene mused. I wonder what happened to it. I don't remember anything from Papa's map. It was called Aridhol, Moraine said. In the days it was an ally of Martha. Staring at the massive walls, she seemed almost unaware of the others, even of Nynaeve, who supported her in the saddle with a hand on her arm. Later, Aridhol died, and this place was called by another name. What name? Matt asked. Here, Lance said. He stopped Mondarb in front of
First in his prime, it would become a celebrated mystery. Otherwise, useless.
Hugely remote period when
I am writing this under an appreciable mental strain, since by tonight I shall be no more. Penniless at the end of my supply of the drug, which alone makes life endurable. I can bear the torture no longer, and shall cast myself from this garret window into the swollen street below. Do not think from my slavery to morphine that I am a weakling or a degenerate. When you have read these hastily scrawled pages, you may guess, though never fully realize why it is I must have forgetfulness or death. It was in one of the most open and least frequented parts of the broad Pacific that the packet of which I was supercargo fell a victim to the German sea raid. Its very beginning, and the ocean forces of the Hun had not completely sunk to their later degradation, so that our vessel was made a legitimate prize, whilst we of her crew were treated with all the fairness and consideration due us as naval prisoners. So liberal indeed was the discipline of our captors that 5 days after we were taken, I managed to escape alone in a small boat with water and provisions.
All right, everyone. I'm gonna call into this live for tonight. But I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all your support. Until next time, everyone. Stay safe out there.
Of the longitude I knew nothing.